There is a moment, and if you've ever lost someone, you know exactly the moment I'm talking about. When you realize that the life you thought you were living and the life that was actually happening around you were two completely different things. This story is about that moment. It's about a man who thought he had made peace with his past, only to discover that his past had been keeping a secret that would change every single thing he thought he knew about himself. It's about a woman who made an impossible choice alone, in the dark, with no one to help her carry it, and then spent nearly a decade carrying it anyway. And it's about a little girl, 9 years old, sharp as a tack, with a shoebox under her bed full of Father's Day cards she had never sent, because she had never had an address to send them to. Before we go any further, I want you to take a breath, because what you are about to hear is not easy, it is not clean, and it does not end the way you expect. But I promise you, every single word of it is worth your time. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Some people leave because they're cowards. Some people leave because they genuinely believe, in whatever broken, half-reasoned way, that people convince themselves of things at 2 in the morning that leaving is the kindest thing they can do. That the person they're leaving will be better off without them. That the mess they are carrying won't follow them out the door. Marcus Cole told himself it was the second one. He was 28 years old, living in a rented apartment on the edge of Caldwell County, Tennessee, and he had just ended the most important relationship of his life. He didn't know it was the most important one. That's the thing about the choices that define us. We almost never recognize them as they're happening. We only see them clearly from the other side, when the damage has already been done and the years have already passed and there is nothing left to do but sit in the wreckage and try to understand how we got there. Marcus drove out of Caldwell County on a cold Tuesday night in October, his truck packed with whatever he could fit in 2 bags, the heater running loud, and the radio turned up high enough that he didn't have to think. And for 10 years, 10 full years, that is almost exactly what he did. He didn't think. He built a life somewhere else. He took construction jobs. He moved from city to city. He made friends and lost touch with them. He dated a few women and kept things surface level enough that none of them ever got close enough to ask the hard questions. He called his mother Ruth on her birthday, and sometimes at Christmas. He sent money when she needed it. He stayed away. He told himself that was enough. He was wrong. But he wouldn't find that out for another decade. And when he did find out, when the letter arrived, forwarded twice, with no return address, landing on his kitchen counter on an otherwise completely unremarkable Wednesday afternoon, Marcus Cole stood in his own apartment and felt the floor go out from under him in a way he had never felt before. Not when his father left, not when he lost his job in 2019, not even on the worst night of his life, the night he never talked about, the night that Ruth had spent 10 years trying to make sure stayed buried. Nothing had ever hit him like that letter. But before we get to the letter, and we will get to the letter, every single word of it we have to go back. Because nothing about this story makes sense unless you understand where it started. And it started the way so many of the most consequential things in a person's life start, completely by accident, on a warm Saturday evening in late June, at a backyard barbecue that Marcus almost didn't go to. His coworker at the time, a man named Danny Pratt, had been after Marcus for weeks to come out and meet some people, stop being such a hermit, get out of his own head for one night. Marcus had said no 3 times. He said yes the 4th time, mostly because he was out of excuses, and Danny had a way of wearing people down that was less pressure and more just relentless good cheer, the kind that makes you feel guilty for resisting it. So Marcus went. He wore a clean shirt. He drank 2 beers over the course of 4 hours, which tells you something about the kind of man he was. Not someone who went at things with abandon, but someone who stayed cautious, who kept one eye on the door, who was always half ready to leave. And he was, in fact, getting ready to leave, keys already in his hand, when a woman on the other side of the yard laughed at something someone said, and Marcus turned to look because the laugh was so unself-conscious, so genuinely unguarded, that it stopped him the way that very few things in his life had ever stopped him. Her name was Diana Walsh. She was 25 years old. She worked at the Caldwell County Public Library, a job she had taken straight out of college and genuinely loved in a way that she was not embarrassed about, which was one of the first things Marcus noticed about her. that she didn't seem embarrassed about any of the things she loved. She loved her job. She loved her small rental house that she was slowly fixing up herself, one weekend project at a time. She loved her best friend Carol, who was standing next to her at that barbecue, and who would later tell anyone who asked that she saw it happen in real time, saw Marcus turn and look, saw Diana notice him noticing, saw the whole thing click into place before either of them had said a single word. They talked for 2 hours that night, standing near the edge of the yard long after the rest of the party had moved inside. They talked about books, because Diana brought it up, and Marcus had not talked about books in years and discovered that he had missed it. They talked about small towns, and whether you could love a place and still feel trapped by it at the same time. They talked about their families in the careful, edited way that people do when they want to be honest but aren't sure yet how much honesty the situation can hold. Marcus told her that his mother Ruth had raised him mostly alone after his father left, that Ruth was a strong woman, that they were close in the way that close could sometimes mean complicated. Diana told him that she had grown up in Caldwell County, that her parents were still together and still drove her a little crazy in the loving way that parents do, that she had thought about leaving 100 times and had always come back. They exchanged numbers before Marcus left. He texted her the next morning, which, if you knew Marcus, if you had known the man he was at 28, would have surprised you, because Marcus was not a man who moved toward things. He was a man who waited. But something about Diana Walsh made him not want to wait, and for the first 8 months of what came next, that instinct felt exactly right. They were, by every account from everyone who knew them both, genuinely good together. Not perfect, Marcus still had that half-open door quality about him, that low-level unavailability that the people who loved him had always run up against eventually. But with Diana, he tried in a way that he hadn't tried before. He showed up. He stayed for dinner instead of making excuses to leave. He met her parents at Thanksgiving and sat at their table and was present for it in a way that felt, to Diana, like a version of Marcus she had been hoping was in there somewhere. Her best friend Carol would later say that during those 8 months, Diana was the happiest she had ever seen her, and then the fight started. Not dramatic, explosive fights, nothing that would have looked obvious from the outside, more like the slow accumulation of small silences, the way Marcus would go quiet when things got emotionally close, the way he would pull back whenever Diana needed him to step forward, the way he always seemed to have one foot out the door, no matter how firmly he had planted the other one inside. Diana tried to talk to him about it several times. Each conversation ended with Marcus apologizing, genuinely, and then doing the same thing again 2 weeks later. By September, Diana had started to wonder if this was simply who Marcus was, if the wall she kept running into was not something he was going to work through, but something that was simply built into him. By October, she was still wondering, and then one night, after a fight that was too quiet and too final to come back from, Marcus packed 2 bags and drove away. He told himself she would be fine. He told himself it was the kindest thing. He drove north with the radio up, and Diana Walsh stood in her kitchen after he left and took a long, slow breath and told herself that she was going to be all right. She did not yet know that in 2 weeks she would take a pregnancy test. She did not yet know that she was going to be a mother. And she did not yet know that the first person she would call, the one person she would, reach out to in that first stunned, terrifying hour, would not be a friend. It would be Marcus's mother, Ruth. And that phone call would set in motion a chain of events that would not fully come undone for 10 years. Diana called Ruth because she didn't know who else to call. Her best friend Carol was out of the country. Her own mother, warm as she was, had a complicated history with unplanned pregnancies in the family, and Diana was not ready for that conversation yet. She needed to talk to someone who knew Marcus, someone who could help her think through what to do, someone who could maybe, help her figure out how to reach him. His phone number was still working at that point. She had not yet tried it. She called Ruth first, thinking that Ruth would be an ally, that Ruth would understand, that Ruth would help her figure out the right words. What happened instead is the part of this story that took years to fully come to light. Because Ruth listened to everything Diana said. She was calm. She was kind, even. She asked Diana how she was feeling, asked if she had seen a doctor yet, asked all the right questions in all the right tones. And then she said something that Diana would replay in her head for years afterward, turning it over and over, trying to decide what it meant and whether she had heard it correctly. Ruth said, Marcus has already moved on. He's with someone else. He left Caldwell County and he has not coming back. And I think, honey, it would be better for everyone, including you, if you made your peace with that and moved forward on your own terms. Diana sat with the phone in her hand for a long time after that call ended. She tried Marcus's number once. It went to a message that said the number was no longer in service. She tried it again 2 days later. Same message. She wrote a letter, an actual handwritten letter, to the address she had for him and mailed it. It came back 3 weeks later, marked return to sender, no forwarding address, and Diana Walsh, who was 25 years old and pregnant and completely alone in a way that she had never been alone before, made a decision. She was going to have this baby. She was going to raise this child. And she was going to build a life that was so solid, so complete, so full in every way that mattered, that the absence at the center of it would never get to be the loudest thing in the room. She was fiercely, privately, entirely determined. And for 9 years she did exactly that. Eleanor Walsh, Ellie, from almost the first day, was born on a Tuesday in March, 7 pounds and 3 ounces, with her mother's mouth and a pair of eyes that Diana recognized the moment she saw them and chose, quietly, not to say anything about to anyone. She was a remarkable child from the very beginning, the kind of child who made adults feel seen, who asked questions that were too perceptive for her age, who had a memory that caught and held things that most people let slip by. She started reading at 4. She had a best friend named Gracie by the time she started kindergarten and was fiercely loyal to her in the way that only small children and the very best adults are capable of being fiercely loyal to anyone. She loved the library, which made Diana laugh, in the quiet, bittersweet way of a woman who finds pieces of herself in places she didn't entirely expect. And every Father's Day, from the time she was 4 years old, Ellie would sit down with her construction paper and her markers, and she would make a card, not because Diana told her to, Diana had never brought it up, but because somewhere in the particular way that children understand the shapes of the things that are missing from their lives, Ellie had decided that her father was real, and that he was somewhere, and that someday she would know him. The cards went into a shoebox. Diana found the shoebox once by accident when Ellie was 7, opened the lid and stood there for a full minute reading 2 years' worth of cards, each one addressed to a dad I'll know someday, before she closed it quietly and put it back exactly where she found it, and went to the kitchen and stood at the sink for a long time. She never said anything to Ellie. She wasn't sure there were words for what she felt in that moment. There was grief in it, and love, and something that was neither one exactly, something that had no name in English, or possibly in any language. She stood at the sink until it passed. Then she went and made dinner. The accident happened on a Wednesday afternoon in September, when Ellie was 9 years old. Diana was driving home from the library, her library, the one she had worked at for almost 15 years now, the one where she knew every regular patron by name and kept a running list of personalized book recommendations on a yellow legal pad in her top desk drawer. She was coming through the intersection at Route 12 and Old Mill Road when a pickup truck ran the stop sign coming from the right and hit her car on the passenger side. The accident was not catastrophic by the clinical, detached standard of these things. No life-threatening injuries, no lengthy hospitalization. Diana had a fractured wrist, 3 cracked ribs, and a concussion that kept her off work for 3 weeks. She was released from the hospital the next afternoon, but in the paperwork, in the standard next-of-kin documentation that the hospital required before they would release her, the form that asked for emergency contacts and family information, and, in one small line near the bottom, the name of the child's other parent, Diana had written Marcus Cole, not because she expected anything to come of it, more as a kind of reflex, the way you fill in paperwork, when your ribs hurt and your head is still spinning, and you are simply trying to get through the next thing. She listed a last known address. She had looked it up once, years ago, out of a need she couldn't fully explain, and had never done anything with the information. The hospital filed the paperwork. A county social worker, doing a routine follow-up check, noted the name and the address and flagged it for a standard wellness notification. A letter was generated, forwarded twice, and landed on Marcus Cole's kitchen counter on an otherwise completely unremarkable Wednesday afternoon in Nashville, Tennessee, where he had been living for the past 2 years. He was 38 years old. He was by any external measure fine, stable job, decent apartment, a small social life. a life that worked. He picked up the letter because it had his name on it. He read it standing at the counter, still in his work clothes. Because he had not yet sat down, he read it once. Then he sat down. Then he read it again. There was a daughter. She was 9 years old. Her name was Eleanor. And beside the line that read Father, in the careful bureaucratic font of county paperwork, was his own name, printed in black and white. The letter did not have Diana's phone number. It had a social worker's contact information and the name of the county and a reference case number, the dry administrative skeleton of something that was anything but dry, anything but administrative. Marcus sat at his kitchen counter for a long time, long enough that the light in the apartment changed. The afternoon sun that came in through the west-facing window moving through to its arc and going amber and then orange and then gone, the room dimming around him while he sat there with the letter in his hands and tried to process what he was holding. A daughter, 9 years old. He had a daughter who was 9 years old and who had been alive for every single one of those 9 years while he was somewhere else, not knowing, not asking, not looking. He thought about Diana. He had not thought about her, not actively, not directly, not in a way he allowed himself to sit with, in years, not since the first year after he left, when her face would surface sometimes in the space between waking and sleeping, when he would find himself wondering, and then deliberately stop wondering, because the wondering led somewhere he did not want to go. He had told himself that she was fine. He had told himself that she had moved on. He had, in the particular way that people manage the things they cannot face, created a story in his head about what her life looked like now. Something comfortable and complete, something that did not include him and did not need him and was better off for his absence. He had believed that story for 10 years. The letter made every word of it collapse. He called the social worker's number the next morning. He asked for details and received the careful, measured, professionally neutral kind that social workers are trained to give. Yes, there was a child. Yes, she was healthy. Yes, Diana Walsh was her mother. Yes, the child's name was Eleanor. No, there was no current custody arrangement on file. Yes, Diana had listed him as the father. He said thank you. He hung up. He went to work. He lasted 4 hours before he told his supervisor he had a family emergency and drove back to his apartment and packed a bag. He was in his truck heading south toward Caldwell County before he had fully decided to go. Some decisions he was beginning to understand make themselves. He arrived in Caldwell County on a Thursday evening, just as the light was going. The town was familiar in the disorienting way that places you haven't seen in a decade are familiar. The same bones, a different skin, new storefronts where old ones used to be, a road widened here, a building gone there. But underneath all of it, the same geography that his body remembered, even when his mind was somewhere else. He got a room at a motel on the edge of town that he had driven past 100 times 10 years ago without ever going inside. He lay on top of the covers that first night and stared at the ceiling and thought about what he was actually doing here. He had a daughter. He had a daughter who had grown up in this town, who had gone to school here, who had a life here that he knew nothing about, that had been built entirely without him, that had been, by all appearances, built well. He thought about Diana doing that alone. He thought about it for a very long time. He did not sleep much. The next morning, Friday, he drove to the county library, not because he had a plan, more because it was the one place he knew for certain Diana would be, and he needed to see her. Not to say anything, not yet, just to understand the distance between where he was and where he needed to be. He sat in the parking lot for over an hour. He was about to leave when she walked out, and seeing her after 10 years was one of those experiences that language was not quite built to carry because she looked like herself, and also like a stranger, like a person he had known, and also like someone he was meeting for the first time, and the 10 years between them were somehow both very long and very short in the same instant. He got out of the truck. He walked across the parking lot. She saw him when he was about 20 feet away, and everything in her face went absolutely still. He stopped. He said her name. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, in a voice that was completely controlled, the flattest and most final 3 words he had ever heard her speak, "You need to leave." He left. He went back to the motel. He sat on the edge of the bed and understood for the first time the full weight of what he was trying to do. He was not coming back to a place where he was wanted. He was not coming back to a situation where anyone was waiting for him. He was coming back to a town where a woman had spent 9 years raising a child alone, A woman who had every reason in the world to look at him and feel nothing but cold, and a child who did not know he existed, and a version of the past that had hardened over a decade into something he was going to have to find a way through rather than around. He thought about leaving. He thought about it seriously, packing up, driving back to Nashville, calling the social worker, and saying he had made a mistake letting things go back to the way they were. He sat with that thought for a long time, and then he thought about the letter. He thought about the line that said Father Marcus Cole, and he thought about a 9-year-old girl who had been alive for 9 years in a town he had been avoiding, and he knew, quietly, certainly, in the way that a person knows the things they cannot unknow, that he was not going to leave. Not this time. He was going to find a way through. He just had no idea yet what that was going to cost him. He was about to find out. He spent the next 3 days in Caldwell County doing almost nothing. He drove around. He ate at a diner on Main Street where the coffee was the same as he remembered it, and the waitress was someone he didn't recognize. He walked past the library twice without going in. He drove down the street where Diana's house was. He had found the address through public records, the way anyone can find anything now if they know where to look, and he sat in his truck at the end of the block and looked at the house without getting out. It was a small house, green with white trim, with a garden out front that had clearly been tended over many years, flower beds that showed the kind of long-term care that a person puts in when they are planning to stay. There was a bicycle on the front porch, a small one, the kind a child would ride. He sat and looked at that bicycle for a long time, and then on the second day, something happened that he had not planned for and could not have planned for, because the particular cruelty and grace of small towns is that in them, things simply happen to you without your permission. He went into the post office on Friday morning. He was standing at the counter filling out a form when the door behind him opened, and he held it without thinking, the way you hold a door. And then he stepped back and a little girl walked through. She was carrying a backpack that was slightly too big for her. She had pigtails. She looked up at him with the particular unself-consciousness of children who have been raised to be comfortable in the world and said, "Thank you," in a clear, confident voice. He said, "You're welcome." She walked away toward the P.O. boxes. He turned back to his form, and then something stopped him. Some reflex, some instinct, something that was more cellular than conscious. And he turned to look back at her. She was on her tiptoes reaching for a mailbox, and she glanced back at him over her shoulder in the way children do when they sense their being. Watched, and she smiled. It was a small, entirely ordinary smile. Marcus felt it like a physical thing. He turned back to his form. His hands, he noticed, were not entirely steady. It was only much later, lying awake in his motel room that night, turning the day over and over, that he placed what had stopped him, the smile. It was his mother's smile, the exact same one. He had been looking at it on Ruth's face his entire life, and he had not recognized it on a stranger's face in a post office until he was already halfway across the parking lot, and then it hit him so hard he stopped walking. He stood in the parking lot of the Caldwell County Post Office on a Friday morning and understood, with a certainty that required no further evidence, that the little girl with the pigtails and the too big backpack was his daughter, Eleanor Walsh, Ellie, 9 years old, and she had no idea who he was. He called his mother that night. Not to tell her what was happening, he didn't do that yet. He called because he needed to hear her voice in the way that you need to hear a person's voice when you are trying to locate something true about them before you accuse them of something you cannot take back. Ruth answered on the second ring. She sounded exactly like herself, steady, warm, with that particular quality she had always had of sounding like everything was fine, regardless of whether it was. They talked for 20 minutes about nothing much. He asked how she was feeling. She asked about his work. He said he was on a job in Tennessee, which was technically true and entirely misleading. She said that was nice, that she was glad he was staying busy. Before he hung up, he said, as casually as he could manage, which was not very casually at all, "Mom, do you remember Diana Walsh?" There was a pause, not a long one, a fraction of a second, the kind of pause that a person who was not paying close attention might not even notice. Ruth said, "Diana Walsh." And then, "Vaguely, honey, why?" Marcus said, "No reason. Just thinking about old times." He hung up. He sat in the dark for a while, because in that fraction of a second, in the tiny hesitation before she said the name back to him, in the particular quality of the pause, Marcus had his answer. She knew exactly who Diana Walsh was. She had always known, and that meant something. He didn't know yet what it meant, not fully, not in all its dimensions, but he knew it meant something, and he was going to find out what. He went to see Ruth in person 2 days later. He drove to her house in the next county over, the house she had moved to 15 years ago after what she had always described as the desire for a fresh start. He had never questioned that explanation. He was questioning it now. Ruth opened the door, and her face, when she saw him, did the same thing Diana's face had done in the library parking lot. It went still, the particular stillness of a person who has been half expecting something for a long time and is now confronted with the fact that the waiting is over. She said, "Marcus, what are you doing here?" He said, "I think you know." They sat at her kitchen table. Ruth made coffee, old habit, the thing she always did when she needed something to do with her hands. Marcus waited, and then he said Diana Walsh's name, and he said to Caldwell County, and he said 9 years old. And he watched his mother's face move through the arithmetic of what he was telling her, and he watched the moment when she understood that he knew or knew enough, and the coffee cup in her hands went very still. What came out in that kitchen slowly over the next 2 hours was not a confession in the clean, cinematic sense of the word. It was more like an excavation. Each thing Ruth said revealing something underneath it that required another question, another silence, another careful excavation. She had known about the pregnancy. Diana had called her. Ruth had listened and then had told Diana that Marcus had moved on, that there was someone else, that it would be better for everyone if Diana made her peace with it. She had not asked Diana how she was doing, or what she needed, or what she was going to do. She had simply closed the door, and then she had said to Marcus the next time she spoke to him, weeks later, when Diana's name might have come up, when he might have called to check in, when he might have given her the opening, nothing. She had said nothing. She had watched a decade go by, and she had said nothing. Marcus sat across from her at the kitchen table and listened to all of this and felt something that he did not have clean, articulate words for, something that was not purely anger, although anger was certainly in it, and not purely grief, although grief was certainly in it too, and was shot through with something complicated that had to do with knowing this woman, his whole life, with loving her, with understanding that she had raised him alone, and that the cost of that had been paid in ways he was only beginning to fully reckon with. He said, "Why, Mama?" And she said something that he had not expected, something that did not make things better, but that landed in him like a stone dropped in deep water, the ripples of it spreading outward for a long time after. She said, "Because of what you did, and I was afraid of what it would uncover." This requires some explanation, and it requires going back further than the night Marcus left Caldwell County. It requires going back to when Marcus was 23, to a night that Ruth had spent 15 years constructing a life around the edges of. A night that was the reason they had moved towns, the reason the family had reset its geography, the reason Ruth had spent every year since watching the rearview mirror with a quiet, permanent vigilance that Marcus had always registered but never fully understood. When Marcus was 23, he was not the man he would eventually become. He was younger and angrier and running from things he didn't yet have names for, and he was drinking in a way that, looking back, he would describe as the drinking of a person who doesn't want to be present in their own life. On a Friday night in late November, he got into his car when he should not have gotten into his car. He drove through an intersection when the light was not in his favor. He hit a young woman named Cassandra Powell, who was walking across the street at the crosswalk with the full legal right to be there. He did not stop. He drove home. He told himself the next morning that it hadn't been as bad as it felt, that maybe she was fine, that it was dark and he hadn't been sure what had happened. He told himself these things with the particular ferocity of a person who is lying to himself and knows it, and has to keep talking to drown out the knowing. Ruth found out 2 days later. She found out because Cassandra Powell's name was in the local paper in a short item about the accident, and Ruth recognized the intersection, and she sat her son down, and she got the truth out of him in about 20 minutes flat. What Ruth did next is the part that she has never fully been at peace with, and the part that Marcus, when he finally understood all of it, struggled the most to know how to hold. Ruth called the family. She called in a favor. The vehicle had not been connected to Marcus yet. It was a truck he had borrowed from a friend, and the friend's name was on the registration. And the friend, when approached quietly and with a great deal of pressure from Ruth, agreed to say nothing. Marcus was never charged. Cassandra Powell had a fractured collarbone, a broken wrist, and a ringing in her left ear that the doctors said would likely resolve itself. It did not resolve itself. She lived with it for years. And Marcus moved through the world for 15 years carrying the weight of what he had done, sometimes buried so deep he could almost forget it, sometimes surfacing at 3 in the morning with a clarity that felt like drowning. Ruth had protected him, and in protecting him, she had made herself the keeper of something that she could not let go of, something that required constant vigilance, constant management, constant control over who got close and what they knew. When Diana Walsh called her, pregnant, frightened, reaching out, Ruth had not heard a young woman who needed help. She had heard her threat. She had heard the possibility of Marcus coming back, of getting attached, of roots growing back into the ground of Caldwell County, of people starting to look closely at the family again. She had acted on that fear in the way that frightened people act, quickly, quietly, and without thinking about the damage they were leaving behind. Marcus did not speak to his mother for 3 days after that conversation. He drove back to his motel. He sat with everything she had told him, and he tried to figure out what to do with it. Not just the part about Diana and the baby, but all of it, the whole architecture of the thing, the long chain of decisions and silences and small cruelties and large ones that had brought him to a motel room in Caldwell County at 38 years old, trying to figure out how to introduce himself to a daughter who had been alive for 9 years. He had not done anything about Cassandra Powell in 15 years. He had not looked her up. He had not tried to find her. He had not written a letter or called a lawyer or made any of the gestures that a person who is genuinely reckoned with a thing might eventually make. He had simply lived alongside it, the way people live alongside the things they cannot face, adjacent to it, in a kind of permanent low-level avoidance that had become so familiar it no longer felt like avoidance. It just felt like his life. But sitting in that motel room, with everything Ruth had told him still fresh, with the image of Ellie's face in the post office still in his mind, with the knowledge of what Diana had done alone for 9 years pressing down on him, he understood, in a way that he could not organize into a speech or a plan, but that was simply present in him, completely and without qualification, that the version of himself that was capable of leaving Cassandra Powell in that intersection and driving away and never looking back was also the version of himself that had packed 2 bags and left Diana and told himself it was the kindest thing, that they were the same failure, the same door, half open, the same man always ready to leave. He was 38 years old, he had a daughter who was 9, and he was not going to be that man anymore. Not because it was easy, or because he had somehow earned the right to stop being him, but because Ellie had been putting cards in a shoebox for 5 years, and the address on them was somewhere, and he was going to be that somewhere if it was the last thing he managed to get right. That was the decision. It was not dramatic. It did not come with a soundtrack. It was just a man sitting on the edge of a motel bed understanding something very clearly about who he had been, and deciding, with the particular, quiet determination of someone who has run out of reasons to keep running, to be someone else. Diana agreed to meet him once. She was clear that it was once, that it did not mean anything beyond once, and that she had conditions. They met at a coffee shop on the edge of town, neutral ground public, a table near the window where she could see the parking lot. She arrived 5 minutes before him and was already sitting down when he came through the door. There was a notepad on the table in front of her. He didn't know that she had been carrying that notepad around for 3 days without opening it, that she had sat down twice to write her conditions, and then couldn't figure out where to start, that the notepad was something like armor. Not something she needed to read from, but something that made her feel less exposed. He sat down across from her. He said her name. She looked at him in a way that was not warm and was not cold and was something more precise than either, the look of a woman who has spent 9 years becoming someone you would be a fool to underestimate. She said, "I don't want an apology. I want to understand what you think you're doing here," he said. "I'm here because I have a daughter. And I lost 9 years I didn't know I was losing." She said, "You didn't lose them. I lived them. She lived them. You were just not there." He said, "I know that." She said, "Do you? Because showing up at a motel and driving past my house and standing in parking lots is not the same as knowing something." He said, "You're right." She said nothing. The silence between them was not comfortable, but it was honest. The silence of 2 people who had something real and complicated between them. and were choosing, for the moment, to sit inside it rather than talk around it. He told her about the letter. He told her about the social worker's call. He told her that he had driven to Caldwell County because he did not know what else to do, and that he was not here to make demands, or to disrupt Ellie's life, or to pretend that 9 years of absence could be walked back in a conversation. He told her about going to see Ruth. He told her carefully, and watching her face as he did, what Ruth had told him, about the call, about what Ruth had said, about the door that had been closed before Diana ever had the chance to walk through it. Diana listened to all of this without moving. When he finished, she sat quietly for a moment, and then she said, "I tried to reach you 3 times. Before Ellie was born, his number was already disconnected." She didn't say it like an accusation. She said it like a fact that she had carried for a long time and was now simply setting down on the table between them. He said, "I know. I didn't know that then." He said, "I'm sorry." She looked at him. She said, "That's a start." She picked up her notepad and her coffee cup and her bag, and she stood up to leave. She said, with her hand on the back of the chair, "I'm not saying yes to anything. I'm not saying Ellie gets to meet you. I'm not saying anything except that I heard what you said, and I need to think," he said. "That's fair." She left. He sat at the table for another 20 minutes, not because he needed to, but because the conversation had taken something out of him that he needed a moment to find again. Outside the window, the main street of Caldwell County went about its regular business, entirely indifferent to the fact that everything was changing. Diana thought about it for 4 days. She talked to Carol, who had been her best friend for 20 years and who knew everything and had, over the 9 years of Ellie's life, cycled through every possible opinion on the question of Ellie's father before settling on the one she still held, that it was Diana's call, that Ellie's well-being was the only thing that mattered, and that Carol would support whatever Diana decided as long as it was honest. Diana did not tell her parents yet. She sat with it alone, the way she sat with most of the big things. Carefully, in the early morning before Ellie woke up, with a cup of coffee at the kitchen table, working through it the same way she worked through anything that required her to be both clear-eyed and fair. She thought about what it would mean for Ellie to meet Marcus and then have him disappear again. She thought about what it would mean for Ellie to reach adulthood never having been given the choice. She thought about the shoebox under Ellie's bed, which she had not looked at since Ellie was 7, but which she was certain was still there, still growing. She thought about Ellie's face in every school photo for 9 years, the eyes that were not Diana's eyes, the particular set of the jaw that Diana had never been able to fully account for. She thought about what Ellie had said to her once, when she was 6, in the matter-of-fact way that 6-year-olds say things that require adults to go sit in the bathroom and breathe wood for a minute. "Mom, everyone has a dad somewhere, right? Even if you can't see him?" Diana had said yes, that was true. Ellie had nodded and gone back to her coloring. Diana had gone to the bathroom. She thought about all of it. And on the 4th day, she called Marcus. He answered on the first ring. She said, "I'm not promising anything beyond this. But Ellie has been asking questions her whole life, and I've been answering them carefully, and I'm tired of carefully. She should get to decide what she thinks of you. I'll tell her there's someone who wants to meet her. I won't tell her who you are yet. That's a conversation I need to have with her first on my terms in my own time. But if she wants to meet you, I'll arrange it," he said. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," Diana told Ellie on a Sunday evening after dinner, sitting at the kitchen table with the remnants of mac and cheese still in the pot on the stove, because that is the kind of moment these things actually happen in. Not cinematic, not carefully staged, just a regular evening in a regular kitchen where an extraordinary thing is being said out loud for the first time. She told Ellie that there was a man who had found out about her and who wanted to meet her. She told Ellie that this man was her father. She told it plainly and without editorial because Diana had always believed that children deserved plain truth and that the editorializing could come later from Ellie herself once Ellie had the facts. Ellie was quiet for a moment. She was sitting across from her mother with her hands in her lap, and she was looking at Diana with the particular focus she had when she was processing something important, the same focus she brought to hard books, to math problems, to questions she couldn't answer yet but intended to. Then she said, "Is he a good person?" Diana said, "I think he's trying to be." Ellie considered that. Then she said, "That's okay. Trying counts." Diana looked at her daughter across the kitchen table. and felt something she would later describe to Carol as the strange grief of watching your child be wiser than you were at her age, proud and heartbroken and full of a love so specific and so enormous that she had no container for it. She just held it and let it be there. Ellie said, I made him cards. Diana said, I know. Ellie said, he can have them. Diana said, we'll see. Ellie went to take a bath. Diana sat at the table for a while and then she texted Marcus, Saturday, the park on Riverside, 11 in the morning. She typed one more sentence and then deleted it. Then she typed it again and sent it before she could change her mind. She's been waiting a long time. Don't be late. He wasn't late. He was there at 9:45, sitting on a bench near the entrance with a wrapped book in his hands, a book he had bought the day before because he hadn't known what to bring. And he had stood in the bookstore for 40 minutes before choosing it, a middle-grade novel that he had loved at Ellie's age, the only honest offering he had. He stood up and sat back down 4 times while he was waiting. Diana arrived with Ellie at 11:05. Ellie saw Marcus before Diana could say a word. She stopped walking. She tilted her head in the way she had when she was thinking carefully about something. She looked at him. Then she walked over. She stood in front of him. She looked at him very directly with the 9-year-old's complete absence of pretense, and she said, Are you my dad? He said, Yeah, I am. She looked at him for another moment, and then she said, You have my grandma's eyes. I saw a picture of her once. She thought I was asleep. She held out her hand. He shook it. And that was how Marcus Cole met his daughter on a Saturday morning in a park in Caldwell County, Tennessee. Not with speeches, not with tears, not with any of the dramatic catharsis that such moments are supposed to require, but with a 9-year-old's handshake and a directness that undid him so completely that it took him a full after she sat down beside him and opened his book and started reading to remember that he was supposed to be breathing. What happened next took time. Time and imperfect, incremental, unglamorous effort of the kind that no one makes documentaries about, but that constitutes the actual substance of how people rebuild things. They met on Saturdays, Marcus and Ellie, in the park, for an hour at first and then 2 hours and then sometimes 3. Diana was always there for the first part and then would sit on a bench far enough away to give them space. Ellie asked Marcus questions, constant, relentless, specific questions, the kind that made him feel both seen and accountable in a way he had never experienced before. She asked him what his favorite book was, and then disagreed with his answer and explained at length why he was wrong. She asked him what he did for work, and then asked a series of follow-up questions about construction that revealed she had done some research on the subject since finding out he was coming. She asked him once, after about 3 weeks of Saturdays, whether he had known about her before the letter. He told her the truth. He told it in the way he had been learning to tell hard things, directly, without softening it into something easier than it was, without asking her to feel anything particular about it. He said, No, I didn't know. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, Okay, that's what I thought. She went back to the book they were reading together. He sat with the word okay for a long time after that and tried to understand what it contained. He decided it contained more grace than he deserved. He decided to try to earn it anyway. Meanwhile, other things were moving. The story about Cassandra Powell, the woman from the intersection 15 years ago, surfaced on a local Facebook group about 3 weeks after Marcus arrived in Caldwell County, shared by someone who had seen his name in connection with the child custody question that had begun quietly to circulate among people who knew Diana. Cassandra had written a statement. She had not named Marcus specifically in the public version, but enough people in the county knew enough of the pieces that the connection was being made, link by link, in the particular visible way that small towns make connections. Marcus heard about it from his motel neighbor, who had no idea what it meant to him. On a Thursday morning, he sat in his truck in the motel parking lot and thought about it for a long time, and then he drove to the address he had found online. The careful, deliberate finding of an address, not the passive stumbling across it. And he knocked on Cassandra Powell's door. She opened it. She recognized him immediately, or at least recognized what his presence at her door meant. She looked at him without expression for a long moment. He said, I was there. I was the one who hit you. I'm sorry. I have been sorry for 15 years, and I have never said it to you, and that was wrong. I'm here because I need you to know that I know that. She looked at him for a long time. She said, I've been waiting for that for 15 years, he said. I know, I'm sorry it took me this long. She did not invite him in. She did not forgive him in any visible theatrical way. She said, "Thank you for coming," and then she closed the door. Marcus stood on the porch for a moment, and then he walked back to his truck and drove away. Whatever it was that had been living in him for 15 years, the thing he had been carrying alongside the guilt, the thing that was harder to name than guilt, the sense of himself as someone who ultimately could not be trusted to do the right thing when it was hard, shifted, not gone, not resolved, but shifted. He was 38 years old, standing in Cassandra Powell's driveway, and he was choosing the thing he should have chosen a long time ago. Better late than never was a thin comfort. He took it anyway. Diana found out about Cassandra Powell through Detective Lena Marsh, who had been the one to take Diana's report 3 weeks earlier, and who called her one morning to let her know about the statement and to make sure Diana had context for what she was hearing. Diana already knew, mostly. She had heard fragments from Carol, who had heard from someone else, the small-town information ecosystem doing what it always does. What she'd from Marsh that she hadn't known was the full shape of it. The night it happened, the fact that Marcus had not stopped, the fact that Ruth had been involved in what happened afterward. Marsh told her this not as gossip but as information, with the careful, neutral professionalism that Diana had appreciated from her. From the beginning, the sense of someone who was doing a job and doing it with integrity. Diana said, "Thank you," and hung up the phone and stood in her kitchen for a while, and then she called Carol. She talked to Carol for an hour. She cried once briefly and then stopped. What she felt, sitting with all of it, was not straightforward. She was not surprised exactly, because she had spent 9 years building a life that required her to be honest about the fact that the man who had left had not been, at the time of leaving, a person who could be relied upon. But knowing the specifics was different from the general fact, and the specifics were heavy. She sat with them. She thought about Ellie. She thought about the Saturdays. She thought about what Ellie had said, that trying counts. She thought about a man who had just driven to Cassandra Powell's house after 15 years and knocked on the door. She did not call Marcus. She needed more time with it. She would tell him, eventually, that she knew, and that conversation, when it came, would be the most honest conversation they had ever had, the kind that leaves you raw and tired and strangely lighter, but that was still ahead of them. For now, Diana sat in her kitchen with a cup of coffee and the particular complicated feeling of a woman who has been alone for a long time and is beginning to understand that alone, whatever it had cost her, had also made her someone she genuinely respected. Whatever came next, she had built something real, and no one, not Marcus, not Ruth, not the history of it, was going to take that from her. 6 weeks after Marcus arrived in Caldwell County, he filed paperwork to be legally recognized as Eleanor Walsh's father. He did not fight Diana on terms. He did not arrive with a lawyer making demands. He arrived with a document and a pen and the simple, quiet statement that he wanted Ellie to have what she had always had a right to have. A father whose name was on paper, who paid child support, who was present in every way the law allowed and as many ways as Diana would permit. Diana had expected a fight. She had been prepared for a fight, had spent a night going her options with a friend who had been through custody proceedings and knew what they looked like. The absence of a fight was something she needed a few days to process. She told Carol she didn't know whether to trust it. Carol said, "Maybe just watch and see." She watched, she saw. He was there every Saturday, he was early every time. He always texted Diana afterward to say what they'd done and how Ellie seemed, not because anyone asked him to, but because he had decided it was what a person who was trying to be trustworthy actually did. Ellie thrived in the way that children thrive when a question that has been unanswered their whole life finally gets an answer. Not perfectly, not without confusion, but with a kind of settled energy that Diana noticed first and said nothing about, because she was still deciding how much she was willing to let herself feel about it. Ruth reached out through Marcus to ask about meeting Ellie. Diana said no. She said it without anger and without drama, simply as a fact. Not yet, maybe someday, but not yet. When Marcus relayed this to Ellie, Ellie said, "That's okay. I'll meet her when I'm ready." Marcus told Ruth this. Ruth received it in silence. What Ruth did with that silence in the weeks and months afterward is a thing that belongs to her, and that took longer to understand than anything else in this story. She had done what she had done from fear, and fear is the most human of motivations, and it does not make what she did acceptable, and it also does not make her a monster. She was a woman who had spent 15 years managing a secret and another 10 years managing the consequences of the first management, and she had made choices in the process that had done real damage to real people, and she was going to have to find a way to live with that. The living with it was not fast and was not clean and is not even now fully done. On the last Saturday of September, 6 weeks into the Saturdays, a cool morning with the first edge of autumn in it, Ellie brought the shoebox to the park. She had it in her arms when Diana dropped her off, and Diana looked at it and knew immediately what it was and said nothing, just watched Ellie walk across the grass toward the bench where Marcus was already sitting. He saw the box before she reached him. He looked at her face and then at the box and then back at her face. She sat down next to him. She put the shoebox on her lap. She opened the lid. He could see the cards inside, a small stack of them, construction paper, marker, the handwriting changing year by year from 4-year-old blocks to 9-year-old loops. She took them out and handed them to him one at a time. He read each one. He read them slowly and in full and without pretending to be less affected than he was, which Ellie seemed to appreciate. One card, from when she was 6, said, "Happy Father's Day to a dad I'll know someday. I hope you are nice and I hope you like books. I made you a drawing of a house with a red door because I think a good dad would have a house with a red door." The drawing was taped to the inside of the card, slightly crooked, a house with a lopsided red rectangle for a door and stick figures in the yard, one tall, one small, both of them. Smiling, he held that card for a long time. When he looked up, Ellie was watching him with her arms crossed in the way she had when she was waiting to see what a person was made of. He said, "You can keep them if you want." She said, "I made them for you. That's why I made them," he said. "Thank you," she said. "You can have them." She said it again firmly, as if he might not have understood the first time, as if she needed to be clear that this was not a loan, this was not contingent on anything, these were his. He took them. He put them back in the box carefully. One by one, he closed the lid. He held the box in his lap the way he had held the letter 6 weeks ago, with both hands carefully, as if it contained something that required that kind of care. Which it did then, Ellie said. "Are you going to come next Saturday?" He said yes. She said, "Okay." She opened the book they were reading and found the page they'd left off on and pointed to the paragraph. He leaned over to read, and that is where the story rests, not ends, because stories like this one don't end in any clean, complete sense of the word. They simply reach a point where they've become something other than what they were at the beginning. What they were at the beginning was a man driving away from something he could not face and a woman raising something extraordinary alone in his absence. What they are now on a Saturday morning in a park in Caldwell County is a little more like a family, imperfect, late arriving, built on ground that had to be cleared before anything could grow in it, but present, real, trying. And some days, Ellie Walsh would tell you, trying is exactly enough. Some roads back take a year, some take a lifetime, some you don't get to take at all. Marcus Cole got a road back, not because he deserved it, not because the years he missed were replaced, or the damage was undone, or the weight of what he had been was simply lifted. None of those things happened. What happened was smaller and more honest than that. A woman decided that her daughter's voice mattered more than her own, very reasonable, very justified impulse to close the door. A 9-year-old decided that complicated people were still people, and a man who had spent his whole life keeping one foot out the door found himself on a park bench on a Saturday morning with a shoebox in his hands and a daughter leaning against his arm, and he kept both feet exactly where they were. That's the story, that's all of it. And before you go, I want to ask you something, because this story raises a question that I think you already know the answer to, but I want to hear you say it. Was Diana wrong to keep the pregnancy from Marcus? Was Ruth protecting her son or protecting herself? And if Marcus showed up at your door after 10 years with a letter, with a reason, with a daughter who had been waiting, would you let him in? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one, and if this story moved you at all, if something in it landed somewhere true, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe